Let's take a look at this game now, here, just to discuss this final concept that we've introduced in a little bit more detail. Right, so here it's black to move, and white has an immediate threat, right, which is to capture the bishop on f5. But black, instead of moving his bishop, he plays the move bishop to b4. So what is the point with this move? Well, if white captures the bishop, we see that this knight right here, it's attacked once and it's only defended once. And remember, we've already said that those situations are especially dangerous. Now, after bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, well, what was the very first topic that we discussed was king safety. And specifically we said, is it generally safe or unsafe? Well, in this case, we can see that white's king is pretty safe. He has a full pawn cover and a strong bishop defending it, but it can be checked. So black here would play knight e2 check and win the queen, which is in fact undefended. Not that it would matter. Even if the queen was defended, it's such a high value piece that black would still be very happy with this. So we see black's nasty idea. What he wants to do is he wants to use this poorly defended knight on c3 to lure the white queen onto the c3 square. And from the c3 square, it will be very, very vulnerable to the d4 knight. Because once again, we have this e2 point. The queen is a sitting duck relative to this knight on d4. Notice, however, how in the original position with the queen on b2, the queen is actually very, very safe against the knight on d4. And the reason for this is because it will take a very long time for the knight to attack a queen when they are arranged in this way. They are on a 3-square diagonal, the knight on one end of that 3-square diagonal, the queen on the other. It'll take at least 3 moves, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, before the knight can land on any square from which it can target the white queen. However, in the case of a queen on c3, as we saw in this example right here, if now queen takes c3, the knight is only 1 move away from targeting the queen. And especially with the king on g1, we can see that it's game over. If the king was on h1, it would be an entirely different story. So we see this sitting duck syndrome occurring here for white. So of course, white saw this in the game. This was a game between two master level players. And after bishop to b4, he decided he would jump onto d5 because from there we see another situation. The knight is able to fork the queen and the bishop. In fact, he did not play this move, but can you see why he wouldn't play such a good move? I mean, after all, if black moves his queen away, then notice how the rook is undefended, the knight is not undefended, but notice how many times it's being attacked? Once. How many times it's being defended? Once. And so if you add an attacker with a move like bishop to e3, we see that that knight will soon fall. And notice how it is pinned. Very similar to how with a knight, earlier on, if we go back in this position, queen takes c3, the queen and the king were very badly arranged relative to this knight. Similarly, the knight and the rook are not well arranged relative to the queen, and this knight and the queen would also be very vulnerable to a bishop that can go on e3, not to mention a bishop that could go to b2, because they are on the same diagonal. So let's return to our position. Now, here we had said if queen to c5, then bishop to e3, and white is simply winning because all of his pieces are sitting ducks here on dark squares. Even the bishop is an easy target. And yet, black actually has a very strong position here. He has a winning position if he can find a tactic. And the move is rook d takes d5. The idea is that after white recaptures, black will now play the move bishop to c3. Now, remember the last time that he played the move bishop to c3, it was capturing a knight. This time around, there is no knight on c3, and yet he still plays that. And the reason is very clever. If white captures the bishop, then knight e2 check. Notice again, you've stepped onto a sort of mined square. You have to be very careful. And if instead you go queen to a3, then black collects this rook on b1, and we see now the point of this move bishop to c3, that the queen, which was on b2 and therefore could have captured the bishop on b1, can now no longer capture that bishop. So white is losing a full rook instead of just an exchange. And once again, we should focus our attention on the fact that this rook was attacked one time and defended only one time. And as I say, when you see those situations, either your opponent has an undefended piece or a loose piece like this one, a badly defended piece, or a little bit frail situation, fragile situation, you should pay special attention to those situations because many times tactical opportunities will be contained in those kinds of positions. Bishop to c3 here being a very flashy example. So in fact, what did white play after bishop to b4? He didn't play knight to d5, he saw all of this, and he went knight to a4 instead. Now the game continued on. After queen b5, he then recaptured the bishop, and the game continued on for a few moves. We will fast forward and show another key moment of this game. So here we are in this position, and as you can see, black has actually managed to win white's queen, but in fact, if you look at the material count, white has gotten so many pieces in exchange for that queen, he has a rook and two bishops, that white is actually completely winning here. But let's show a nice example of this final point. Now, we've been talking about more than only this point because in chess everything is incredibly interconnected. But to return to the final point, which was this sort of when pieces are sitting ducks, when pieces are lined up in a certain way, either if they're lined up on a diagonal, then they're going to be very vulnerable to bishops and also to queens. If they're lined up on files or ranks, then they'll be very, very vulnerable to a rook. Maybe you guys remember how earlier on we had this example with the king on c8. We originally set it on b8, then we shifted it to c8 in that crazy position with the pawn on a4 that eventually the pawn went to a3 and there was a knight on b2, and you guys maybe feel like I'm not making too much sense, but hopefully some of you guys remember this particular position. And we had one variation in it where just by changing the king so that it was on the same file as a bishop that lay on c4 in that example, just by placing the king on c8 and the bishop on c4, we suddenly allowed white the winning move of rook to c1, right? Because the pieces were lined up on a file. And if the example itself, you can't recall it, that doesn't matter. All that matters is that we note that pieces on a file or on a rank are going to be especially vulnerable to rooks. Pieces along diagonals are going to be especially vulnerable to bishops. And pieces arranged sort of in this very unique way, kind of L-shaped way, like multiple L shapes, are going to be especially vulnerable to knights. And of course, pieces along both files, ranks, and diagonals are going to be vulnerable to a queen. So in this position here, can you see any pieces lined up along a diagonal for black? Well, he has no pieces lined up along a diagonal. We see the queen and the knight are on separate color squares, so they cannot possibly be on the same diagonal, and the king is too far away. Does black have any pieces lined up along a file? No, they're all on separate files. The B file, the E file, the H file. What about a rank? Again, no. The knight is on the 4th rank, the queen is on the 6th rank, the king is on the 7th. However, there is one particular danger situation for black right now. The queen and the king are lined up, vulnerable to what piece? The knight. So white has a knight, and the first thing a strong player will ask himself is, can I bring that knight to g5? And sure enough, the knight is only 2 squares away. So we must consider the move knight to e4. But if we play this move, we have a huge threat, that's for sure. But our rook is left undefended. So can he not simply take our rook on d5? Well, in this case, the queen is no longer arranged in this dangerous situation, but it's in a new dangerous situation. The queen and the king here, what is the square? f6, right here. It's no longer g5, but f6 is winning the queen for free. Now, what if instead black captured the rook with his knight? Well, in this case, the queen remains on e6, and so knight g5, and it's game over. So now, because of all of this, we can see that the rook cannot move. In fact, so because of all of this, we see that in fact the rook is what we would say immune. It's immune to being captured. Black in fact played the move queen to c8. And now, well, if we think about squares where the queen and the king are in trouble relative to a knight, we see that d5 is one of them. That's why the queen couldn't capture the rook. And we see that a square like e8 is also one of them because knight f6 would fork the queen and king. And however, we can also see that if the queen was on d7, then knight f6 would once again fork the king and queen. So that's another dangerous square. So in fact, white uses this to play the clever move rook d7. Now, what happens? Well, if black captures the rook, then knight f6, game over. So black has to defend this undefended point, right? It may only be a pawn, but it's an important pawn. So black goes king to g8. And by the way, I should say, why is it such an important pawn? Because it's protecting the king. But now white jumps in with the knight, knight f6 check, and the black king steps away onto f8. Notice how here in this position, the knight and the king are indeed now lined up in the same diagonal. So white used this. It's not even necessarily the best move in the position, but he did use this characteristic to play the move bishop to a3. And if it wasn't for the fact that black has a move such as a5 and can defend the knight, well, the threat itself is very, very strong, right, to capture a free piece. In the game, after a5, white took the knight with check, and here black played the rather bizarre looking move king to g7. You're down too much material. You cannot afford to ignore this bishop on b4. Perhaps black was counting on the fact that the knight is attacked and the bishop is attacked. So there are two attacks. Nonetheless, bishop to e7 would deal with both, and so white would keep his extra piece. We'll see what white did in a second, but I want to show you in this position here after king to f8, bishop to a3, a5, bishop takes b4, why black probably didn't capture that bishop. His concern was the move bishop to d5, and we notice again, this is the best move from a tactical point of view, and it's based on two things. First of all, it's based on a particular type of checkmate pattern, right? White controls the e8 and g8 squares with his knight and therefore threatens rook takes f7 with checkmate supported by the bishop. That is the mating pattern. But for our purposes, what we want to look at is the fact that this pawn on f7 in the initial position right here was, as we've talked about quite a bit at this point, was loose. The pawn is defended only one time by the king and attacked one time by the rook. So it's not that well defended. It's not overprotected, for example. And therefore, after bishop to d5, there's an immediate, and in this case, crushing threat. Let's see what happened in the game instead. Bishop takes, king now went to g7. And as we have said, white could have played the move bishop to e7. But he did not do so. Instead, he once again used this sitting ducks concept, right? This idea of watching out for how the pieces are arranged and trying to determine if they are dangerously placed, right? So we saw that in the beginning of this with the move bishop to c3. Remember this move, bishop to c3, queen takes bishop. That would put the queen and the king in a bad situation, and then knight e2 check wins the queen. So here now, of course, it's white who's having all the fun, so let's return to the position. Well, now we see that the king and the queen, they're on different color squares, so they must be on the same color square for it to be possible to fork them with a knight or with either of the bishops, simply because, you know, a knight can never fork two pieces. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but a knight can never fork two pieces that are on different colors. You try and do so and you won't get very far. And similarly, a bishop cannot do that because a bishop is limited to only one set of squares, right? So only a queen or a rook can fork pieces on different color squares. So here black is down to only the queen as well as his king. So white played the rather clever rook to c7. And again, using the same idea that black cannot capture the rook because after knight e8 check, we have the same type of pattern that we've been discussing for the last while. So I should say how the game actually finished was queen went to d8, and now the threat is to capture the bishop, and also the knight on f6 is undefended. So white simply went bishop to c3, defending absolutely everything. Black struggled on for a couple more moves, but clearly white has so many pieces that there's nothing to be done. And after the move f4 check, in fact, black chose this moment to resign. But the result of the game is not what matters. What matters is the 4 main points that we've discussed in this section. So let's quickly recap the 4 points that we've talked about. The first one, king safety. Ask yourself, is my king or my opponent's king vulnerable in any general way? Is it a little bit unsafe? That can lead to tactics. Maybe the king in general is kind of safe, but there is one open line, like an open diagonal, or an open file or a rank, or it can be checked by a knight. Keep those possibilities in mind. So in other words, ask yourself, can my king be placed in check, or can my opponent's king be checked? After that, we look at undefended or poorly defended, in other words, loose points in any given position. That can be a piece, a pawn, sometimes even a square. It's very easy to focus on undefended points, but loose points, in other words, a point that is defended and attacked an equal number of times, many players neglect to focus on that. Afterwards, we commented on pieces that can be trapped. That usually happens in your half of the board or your opponent's half of the board, right? And it's a piece that has ventured too far into enemy territory. But not always. In the example that we showed, the queen was actually on the e5 square, the black queen, for those of you who recall. And the black queen on e5 was, in fact, in sort of on the border, but still in black's half of the board. And yet it was trapped. The fourth point is perhaps the trickiest point to actually implement into your own games, but I wanted to mention it anyway because I think it's very, very important. And that is looking at the relationship between the pieces and trying to figure out, well, is the queen and the king on the same file? Well, maybe I have a rook that can take advantage of this. Is the queen and the king on the same rank? And it doesn't have to be the queen and the king, of course. Any two pieces. Is the queen and the king on the same file? Well, in this case, we may be able to exploit that by using a rook, if we have one. Is the queen and the king, or any other piece for that matter, on the same diagonal? Well, in this case, let's check if we have a bishop or possibly a queen to take advantage of this. And perhaps the trickiest one, and that's why it's good that we focused on this one, is the knight, because of the funky L-shape nature of its movements. But to notice if a queen and king are arranged, or any other pieces arranged in a particular way that can be exploited by a knight. That's also very important. So even in this final position right here, if we notice after the move king takes g5, we see that our knight cannot really take advantage of the placement of the queen and the king because there are two squares from which it could do so, e6 and f7. Notice how from these two squares the knight would be forking the king and queen. But of course it's too far away from those squares. But a strong player will no doubt still keep that in mind just in case in the future maybe that'll be relevant. And not only that, not only with the knight, but notice how the king and the queen, they're arranged in a way that both the rook and the bishop could potentially fork them, could attack them. If we could fly our rook to d5, from there it would be targeting the queen and the king. And if we could replace, let's say, move our knight away to d5 and replace the knight with a bishop, then from there it would be targeting the queen and the king as well. So this is what I mean when I talk about pieces being like sitting ducks. In some situations, they will be very easy targets, and in other situations, when they're arranged differently, they will be much more difficult to target with certain pieces, or even impossible to target with certain pieces. As we've commented, a knight cannot attack, or a bishop for that matter, cannot attack two pieces if they're on different colored squares. So that's it as far as this section goes, as far as an examination of the different characteristics of a position that we should focus on when looking for tactics. This is a very, very important topic, and in my opinion, it's somewhat neglected. Very often, people solve tactics. Maybe some of you guys have done a lot of work on tactics books or online tactics, solving puzzles and problems and all of this. But it's important also to understand why certain positions are much more rich in tactical possibilities than others. And if you take this framework that we've spent quite some time looking at and sort of designing, if you take that and you begin to apply it to your games, you'll realize that many of your blunders and your opponent's blunders and your successful tactics or missed tactics, almost all of them, in fact, if not all of them, will be able to be categorized under this framework that we've outlined in this section. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you learned something new. And truly, I cannot recommend enough that you begin to focus not only on solving particular tactics, but also in understanding why those tactical possibilities, those tactical shots were there in the first place. That will greatly help your ability to defend against tactical threats and also to spot tactics. And the reason for this is because you will know when you should be on high alert. Whenever you see these characteristics in a position, it sort of gives you the map to try and figure out where exactly the shots may come from. So that's it as far as what to look for. Now we're going to talk about specific tactical themes one by one, so I hope to see you there.